Welcome everyone to today's impromptu-ish Platform SIG. I don't think we really have much of an agenda. It's more meant to be a discussion. So if you all have topics you'd like to bring, I know that there are some topics of discussion that we would like to kind of tackle. I'm going to be taking notes on the Platform SIG agenda doc, which I can pin to the Platform SIG Slack channel. That would probably be a good thing to do. Did you want to say anything as well, David?
Just that these meetings are regularly scheduled every other Thursday at some time, depending on your time zone. And the Spinnaker governance repo has a list of all the SIG meetings, and there's a whole Spinnaker calendar with all the things on it. So don't just join us today. Come and join us all the times. Should we start asking people what they want to talk about, or yeah? And can remote people ask questions somehow, or?
Yes, I'll read you what my questions are.
Perfect. Maybe if there are any questions remotely, let's start with them. Or there's one here.
Not so far.
Great. What's up? Default install. My skin always sort of crawls at the word default, but yeah, I think you're talking about like the agreed upon community install mechanism.
How about a less skin crawly one? Consolidating install methods.
Sure. Yeah. I guess I'll try to give the sort of background, a little bit of how did we get here, and then see if we all agree on where here is, and then try to figure out what to do next. So in the beginning of my time with Spinnaker, there was a thing called Halyard, and that was the one true way. And I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say nobody likes Halyard. It's sort of hard and painful to maintain. It's like extra layers of configuration that's hard to keep up to date. If you add a config flag in like a Java class in CloudDriver, and then that needs to somehow make its way into Halyard, it's like that'll never happen, and it's too annoying, and it's hard to do infrastructure as code because there's this CLI, and anyway, it's painful. So I think it might even be, I don't know if it's deprecated or it's just like spiritually deprecated, but there's like a general notion to try to find something different. Yes?
It's literally deprecated, but in the Cleat RFC. So there's no other reference to it being deprecated.
So, and the Cleat RFC is like merged into, right, and it's probably been accepted or something. So there's another repo called Cleat, of course, with a K, that some really smart Google folks were working on, that was supposed to be a replacement for Halyard, and seemed kind of great. It turns out that what the Halyard CLI does is make a Halyard config file, and then when you say hal deploy apply, it takes your Halyard config file and does the thing. I know in a previous life, I skipped the CLI and I just had the hal config file committed to Git, so I could like vaguely do GitOpsy things. But I think what Cleat did is try to define the contract of the hal config file, and then take that and turn that into some customized things. And I never used it, and so I might not be the right person to say, but I got the sense that like Cleat was a way to migrate away from Halyard, but if you never used Halyard in the first place, then Cleat doesn't really help you. And the people who made Cleat are no longer with us, and so Cleat is sort of a little DOA, and for people new to the community, it isn't really helpful. And then somewhere along the way, or maybe I have the sequence wrong, maybe this came before Cleat, folks at Armory wrote this operator, which still uses Halyard under the covers, which is sort of unfortunate, and it doesn't have to use Halyard under the covers, but it does. And that's supposed to make life easier for people who run Spinnaker on Kubernetes, which, even though we think it's everybody, is not everybody, which is a good time to mention that Halyard does this other thing, which is deal with people who run with Debian packages on VMs. And PS, when we publish things, we don't just publish Docker images, we publish Debian packages. So I think there's a maybe, Fernando, you started like the what are we going to do issue or RFC or something. I think it was even, I think maybe the point of it is to like standardize on the operator. And that thing's been sitting for a while and generating some lively comments, and maybe we could get some more lively comments here before I rant. Maybe you want to rant.
Just want to give a operator. No, So there's I just wanted to mention the RFC process. This is kind of a common process within open source projects. So if you have any changes that you want to make to the project, and they're widespread changes, like changing the install method, updating something else, or I'm a little tired today. But the idea is to propose your changes and get comments from the community. We are a community, and we do want to support different types of use cases. And the operator definitely does not deploy to not Kubernetes. So it's one of those things where we do want to do install consolidation. And I don't know if that means choosing one or choosing a couple so that our use cases are all covered, but we definitely want to get rid of Halyard. But I just wanted to mention the RFC process and I guess not get too off track. Copy?
So today, the Cleat is not being maintained, right? So the only option we really have is Halyard. And most of the people who are currently using Spinnaker are using Halyard. Some of these new changes that are coming up with the cloud driver, all the options are going into the Halyard. So this operator, it's...
You said all the options are going into Halyard?
Yes, the Halyard is being updated for the new cloud driver options for the Google extensions.
I mean, I haven't seen any PRs into Halyard that do anything besides barely keeping the lights on.
So I've seen a few of them.
It's certainly possible. People can make PRs to Halyard to continue to...
Right, so
and that would be okay. Because we don't have anything else except the operator, and there are two operators. And anyway, we can talk more about the operator. But I mean, Halyard is, even though it's mentioned as being deprecated, I don't know, maybe there's some conflict about like most people, because a lot of people seem to be using the operator, and it does its thing. But anyway.
So if the operator is underneath is using Halyard and not Cleat, then how are we getting rid of Halyard?
Well, I guess that's a good question.
Yeah, so right now the operator is based on Halyard. That was a decision made out of convenience at the time, but it was never the end state. So one of the things that we do want to do before it gets donated to the open source project is to actually remove Halyard. Not just because we want to use Cleat or whatever, right? The goal is to make it easier for people to use. Right now, if configuration options are split, like if you misconfigure something or you add a configuration value that the operator doesn't validate for and it gets sent to Halyard, if Halyard returns a 500 right now, the experience is not super great, right? Like you're stuck looking into different places for logs. So we want to get rid of Halyard, make sure that all of that is coming from a single place, and then make sure that, I don't know, that gets donated. But I mean, ultimately the goal with operators is to make sure that we're encapsulating all of the best practices that we have in the community for operating Spinnaker in the project itself. And that's one of the things that Cleat won't do, right? Like Cleat is just really managing configuration files and then splitting it across a number of different projects. And the overriding, I guess, goal with that RFC in particular is to make it easier for people to get started with their first Spinnaker cluster. So that's the motivation.
I understand the motivation, but my point is, if we don't have an alternative for Halyard today, and we don't have a timeline for operator removing Halyard and donating to the community, then we are left with Halyard, right? So there needs to be a time frame before we say we completely deprecated Halyard. Right.
Okay. Part of that RFC, the reason it's not merged yet is because we want to make sure that we agree on that timeline. So there was a timeline listed originally. We had hopes to have it merged in before Spinnaker Summit. Didn't happen. That's totally okay. So we would want to update that timeline, but we do want to agree with the community, like, hey, this is the timeline that would work should we want to move forward with this. where we would remove Cleat, make sure that it's donated, and make sure that it's well documented, and that everything, there's like a whole bunch of dependent stuff that needs to happen, right? The whole website right now is still Halyard oriented. So that's like a whole effort on its own to make sure that we update any install instructions. But yeah, that all goes into that process. So we're not necessarily like saying, hey, let's do this. It's like, hey, let's do this on this timeline, and then make sure we all agree before we go forward.
I'm going to try to summarize some comments that Carl made on the PR or the PR. Carl and I work together at Salesforce, so we talk about this stuff a lot. And maybe he's even on the call, but it's probably real early in the morning in New Zealand where he is. He explained this probably better than I'm going to, but the general idea is that although we want to make it easy for people to start, we also want to make it easy to live in what we call the day two experience. And what we think we learned is that nobody ever runs one instance of Spinnaker. Either you're like testing a new thing, or you have prod and pre-prod, or you have disaster recovery, or whatever it is, you almost always have two. At least you have more than one, and some of us have way more than two. But the point there is that to deploy the operator, or maybe not to deploy the operator, but to use the operator, you have a custom resource, which is a blob of Kubernetes YAML. That because you have more than one of them, you need to somehow parameterize and manage with, like, say, customize. And so if you're going to the dance of doing that, then you might as well be using customize to, organize the Kubernetes YAML for Spinnaker. Like, what's the point of having an operator? Kubernetes already has operators for managing deployments and services and ingress and config maps. So, like, what's the operator doing for you? And I understand this notion of like best practices, but I think that sort of falls apart because then you end up trying to implement Spinnaker and all of its practices, like blue greens and canaries and whatever, into the Spinnaker operator, and like, I just don't get it. It seems complicated for no reason, or at least for not enough benefit to justify the complexity. So I say we ditch Halyard and ditch the operator and use customize to nicely compose like a base of stuff that will, install Spinnaker, and then people will get used to like patching customize to do their custom things, and then we'll go on with our lives. And some Ansible scripts to deal with the Debian packages, and all of this I think got much easier with Spring Boot 2.4 in the way that profiles are sort of, they work with more of like all of the files in a directory instead of like a specific file with a profile name bolted onto the end. So this is in theory something Carl was going to do that would make this a lot easier to talk about, but it's not done, so we can just use hope at the moment. What's up?
Just a comment on like dropping the operator and the day two. What operator does is lowers the barrier for the first Spinnaker users. It's easy to see the customized patches and visualize the changes. I'm okay with doing like proper Kubernetes manifest. I can do it, but I have 3 years production experience in Spinnaker. Like a newcomer won't be able to do that. So yeah, we can do the best practices using like native Kubernetes manifest, but is it easy for the newcomers to the community to take advantage of the power of Spinnaker and productionalize it? I don't think so with the current state of the documentations. Like, that's...
Cool. So yeah, I think a lot of what you had said, David, it makes a lot of sense. I personally don't like Halyard. I remember when I first joined the Spinnaker team on the Apple side, I was really confused by the tool, to be honest. I was like, what does this thing do? It generates configs and it deploys deploy Spinnaker. I was like, isn't there already tooling for that? I don't get it. So I completely agree. I think we should go with more of an industry standard. I do understand that, like that it's going to make, it's probably going to be a little bit tougher, but like a new person coming in, if they're probably going to be more familiar with something like Customize or like Helm, right? Now they have to go learn a whole new tool, right? Like Halyard. Like that doesn't seem like a good idea. So I'm on board with like deprecating it, but I think we just need to do it right. Create a timeline, create a roadmap on how we want to go about, implementing something with like Customize or whatever tool we choose to use. But I think it is important getting rid of it because, like I said, for me coming in, it confused me more so than it helped me. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents there.
Yeah, I think there's broad agreement to get rid of Halyard. The question is, what do we replace it with? And this notion of like what's easier for the most beginning people, it's a little hard to have the conversation because we don't know what we're comparing against. But I would think that like we can give enough of a basis where like the things that people have to fill in are still the same things that people have to fill in. Like, I haven't used the operator, so I don't know, but you still have to give it something. Like, I don't know what you have to give it, the location of your Redis instance, the location of a database or something. And I suspect these are the same things that you'll have to give to customize, to do it sort of the plain Kubernetes way. Sorry.
The power users, the heavy production Spinnaker users, are okay to do a config map with the local cloud driver configuration, the echo configuration, whatever, and change that, and do blue, green, and whatever to deploy Spinnaker, right? But those that are not very familiar with the operating Spinnaker, it won't be very intuitive to do that. And they will struggle a lot with the first installation. And that's why the operator abstracts that difficulty to configure and maintain that config maps for the Spinnaker services. Like, that's it. But for the power users, yeah, let's drop Halyard altogether and you can do whatever you want.
Do you have one maybe suggestion here? So it sounds like we're trying to talk about two different experiences. The first experience of getting started with Spinnaker and then those day 2 operations. Is it worth considering taking inspiration from some other projects? For example, when you're getting started with like a new React project, you have this create React app, and then there's an eject command that you can do if you want to go down your own custom route. Is that something that we would want to consider here? Like we have an operator that does optimize for that first user experience, and then there is a way to eject if you want to manage everything yourself after that point? Or is that overcomplicating and getting us into the same situation?
See, the issue here we are talking about is more of a Halyard too, right? So the Halyard. So now there are two options. We can have a customize that does deploy directly to Kubernetes that gives you the base installation thing. It doesn't have to be operator. But in the day 2 operations also, right now what we are finding with Halyard is any changes that we want to make, you have to change code, which it doesn't work very well for us to maintain it. And also if you want to have additional options, there are some of these cloud driver files that are generated from repository that are built in, right? So then you have to build all these extensions, customizations to make changes to that. So we agree that Halyard needs to go away, but if operator is again using Halyard, we still run into the same kind of issues. We could come up with a Helm package that we already have, or the customize that simplifies that installation. I think we have to focus on those for the startup experience as well as day 2 experience, right?
Would it help to simplify the experience if we just assumed as a part of that RFC approved that Halyard would go away? We're not talking about Halyard. Any
Yeah, I mean, for my take is that instead of investing the time to rip halyard out of the operator, invest the time to rip out the operator. It's a net simpler experience, and we can make it so that it's better for everybody, day one and day two, for the beginning people and the advanced people. The base thing that we provide is still going to be the same. The advanced people can do whatever we want. We don't really care about them. The base people, the initial install of Spinnaker is not and does not need to be some kind of blue-green canary anything. It just needs to install Spinnaker, kube control, apply. That's it. So, there are limited cycles in the world. I would say make the simplest thing.
Just look at any other CNCF project, like Argo CD. Like, the first installation thing they tell you to do is install kubectl and then curl something into kubectl, and it gets you started. Now, we all know that that's far from what you need to have a full operational, enterprise-ready Argo CD environment. But if we can learn a lot from just keeping something simple, because then we at least have a platform to answer questions. Right now, people are just like opening up messages on Slack saying, I tried to install, getting this weird version error. I'm running into this. Operator doesn't work, right? Or at least we can then like educate from a base of, oh, you just did the basic install, right? Let's go on to that next step. Like, oh, how do I add a provider? Or how do I add another storage, persistent store, right? And I think we can all benefit from that, because like right now, it's like, I think the question was raised of how are people installing it? Some people are watching old YouTube videos from like 2017, 2018 to install it, right? I installed the Debian one in our last job because that was the only way to get started initially at the start. But I think we as a community just need to kind of figure that path out. So
I guess I have one more thing to say about that. I think I have a suspicion that every company that runs Spinnaker sort of resolves this problem, and we tried to publish like a community Helm chart, and it turns out that Helm is sort of a drag for this, because you have to sort of decide everything that's going to be customizable, parameterizable, and make it a value, and then somebody can set the value, and then somebody adds a new thing or somebody forgets, and so like it's hard to make this sort of base from which people can build on, so that there's like, again, a way that people install Spinnaker, and then like companies that are doing fancy things can do fancy things, but like so basically this is just to say that like, Helm sucks and customize wins, and so let's use customize, and then that has a chance of having what Joel was saying, like a basis that everybody can agree on. Like if it's not working, go back to that, and then people who are doing fancy things will be able to do it in a more composable way.
So yeah, I think from me, because I noticed that you were talking more from like the first user experience. So I definitely think we're trying to solve like two problems here. One is just like, just being able to deploy it using like another tool that, in my opinion, that should be more familiar with like just people that are coming into the Kubernetes space or whatever deployment space. And then we have the issue of knowing what all the configuration does, right? I think which is, I think your point, right, with the config maps and operators. And I think that is solvable. I mean, we can say documentation and whatnot, but like generally when I'm dealing with like a massive piece of software, I think Spinnaker has this, but like when I deploy, like when I do the first like tool to like deploy it or whatnot, like locally, it'll create the config file, but just have everything commented out. And then I just like opt into the things that I want, and then it's all documented. I think if we just did that, that would solve like a lot of the problems that you were talking about. So I think that might be a step that we could potentially take. But like I said, there's multiple ways to skin this cat, and I think the first step is choosing the right tool, and then thinking about how can we leverage that tool to make it easy for newcomers to come along and use Spinnaker.
Yeah, that topic of what are all the possible config knobs is sort of a different topic. It adds a lot of motivation to the thing we've already agreed, which is that halyard needs to die. Once halyard is gone, there will still be config in, I'm going to say, 2 places instead of 1, or 3 places instead of 2. And there are some unfortunate details of some of the way some config properties work in Spinnaker, so that like Spring Boot has a config props endpoint. I don't know if people know this, but you can like say curl cloud driver /config props, and it'll tell you everything except these dynamic ones that don't show up in that endpoint. So if people get fired up about this, it could be an exercise to ditch all the dynamic ones and turn them into real ones that would show up at that endpoint. And that might help the kind of thing you're talking about. Trying to like maintain a file that has all the values. If that's not maintained in some automated way, will of course get stale. I'm biased because I'm comfortable like reading the code. But at some point, if you want to find out what the flag is, that's sort of what you have to do. And there is probably a better way, but it does add some friction too. Joe, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's most difficult for me to understand about Halyard is it tries to do everything. And so tools like Operator, I think, do a lot of the same thing, where it's both like attempts to fully manage the configuration of the application and also the infrastructure. And those things are combined a little bit. Like you have to define where bits of infrastructure are and the names of things and URLs and credentials and so on. But beyond that, we don't use Halyard we use the smallest part of Halyard possible, which is basically it will generate the basic manifest for all the service and apply them. We use Spring profiles that are generated in other ways for everything else, including persistent storage and URLs and where things are. But for us, we use the very smallest part of Halyard possible. And it might make sense to like try to separate the configuration of the application from all of this stuff, because it's very possible to have a sane default configuration that works out of the box, that functions in a normal way. It's like, all right, great, we've got this, Helm chart or whatever it is, customized set of whatever's, some Terraform script that fires up stuff on AWS. It's all really, a horse apiece, but that can have a sane configuration out of the box. It starts up a database, it starts up a Redis, it just gives you all the things in a somewhat sane configuration. And then from there, we have a way to maintain the application configuration in a much more sane way. So either through programmatic means, getting information about Spring Boot. There have been previous efforts to use Spring Cloud Config, and at the end of the day, there's a million ways where you can reasonably deliver Spring configuration to a Kubernetes cluster or something else. But I don't know, it feels to me like it'd be worth having a tool that creates infrastructure being distinct from a tool that manages the configuration of the application, because conflating those two things is always it's impossible. Like we were saying before, Halyard it knows about a lot of config that's in Spinnaker, but it doesn't know about everything, and like every gap makes it like that much exponentially worse, where you always have to go and write a config file into a Spring YAML file somewhere, even if you're using Halyard, even if you're using some other tool, even if you're using Operator. Like, none of that supports everything. So it might just be best to accept that and just be like, all right, we need a way to manage the application configuration, a way to, figure out what's available, distinct from how we operate the infrastructure. So, that's how we've been doing it internally for the most part. And maybe useful to just like bring those ideas further apart. So.
Yeah. So I like the idea of separating application and infrastructure. I think that makes sense. One of the questions that I still have then is going down this customized path for a moment here, right? Like we make this decision, customize is the way forward. How do we how do we make it obvious to users when they've misconfigured something? I think we've all experienced something right now where we've configured something in Spinnaker and we don't find out until a pipeline doesn't execute the way we expect. And then it's kind of like a path to figure out which service do I need to look in, which log. That can be a topic on its own, but do we value as a community the ability to validate those configurations before they get applied? And if so, how do we want to do that with Customize? Because that's something that we do provide today, both through Halyard and the operator experience, is this notion of validation of configuration values, so that those newer users understand, hey, I configured this S3 bucket, but I can't actually talk to it. Or, hey, you know, I haven't configured a default account for my Kubernetes provider. Like, those are the kinds of things that will trip up new users to the community. And I want to make sure, at least we're consciously making that decision to not worry about it with Customize, and we find some other way to do it, or we find a way to bring it in to the world. And there are a few things that we can do here, right? Like with Customize, we can use conftest, which is this tool to like make assertions around YAML. And we could go that route if we wanted to. So there's options here. I just want to get everybody's take. Like, what do we value in that experience as the folks in the room here?
Sorry. The validation is obviously very important, right? Particularly for the people who are starting off right now. They don't want to figure out which service logs to look for. Yeah, we need to provide some validation, but separating out the infrastructure from the application, what we have seen mostly people, the way they use it is all the cloud driver accounts, cloud accounts, or Artifactory accounts, they're all dynamically set. Most of the configurations today come through dynamic means, whether they are creating pipelines or creating applications, they're all dynamic. So it's the infrastructure in terms of how the Spinnaker comes up, which persistent stores that it connects to. Those are the ones that initially is set up. And for the people who are starting up, for them, if we can give that configuration and have some way to provide the error reporting properly, the rest of the application configuration can be dynamic like this. So today, the generation of this dynamic configuration, everyone has built their own automation around to create these accounts, create these applications. So that's a second topic. I think we should address that as well. But today, I think we are focusing on initial configuration. So since the initial configuration is only going to be a small set of things that we want to bring up, like for Argo CD, for example, brings up the Redis, and for 3 different services, it comes up. So we can do something like that.
I think for me, the priority for validation is to make sure it's in one place. And I think whatever validation the operator is doing today, it's sort of getting lucky at. It's getting lucky in the sense that it's like matches with the code because somebody did a bunch of work to get it to match, and tomorrow it will stop matching. So I see this as mostly a coding problem where, like, if something bad happens, ideally we want something to not start. And if something, there's of course lots of nuance to every particular parameter and every particular kind of brokenness. Some things, it's better to start and warn, or start and not warn. Or like if there are no accounts, make it okay for there to be no accounts or something. But yeah, for sure, like, let's validate to the level of schemas and what we can that somebody doesn't have a syntax error in their YAML, or they're missing a required field in a Kubernetes object. But if something's missing at the Spinnaker level, yeah, I mean, what assumptions do we have about people who are installing Spinnaker for the first time? Do we think that they understand the notion of like shipping their logs out of the cluster into a log aggregator, which you sort of have to have? But I realize that some people are learning Spinnaker at the same time that they're learning Kubernetes, and sometimes it's hard to help those people, and we're happy that you will take their money and charge them by the hour and hold their hand. I don't know how much we need to hold everybody's hand as a result.
So I kind of hold probably a not unpopular opinion on validation. I don't like client-side validation at all. I think it's horrible. I think it's a good way for the front end and the back end to easily get mismatched. Whenever you make an update to the back end, you now have to update the front end, and there can be a little bit of friction there. If you have a small team, that's easier. But like if you're working in a large org where you might have like some front end engineers, and you might have the back end engineers, and you would have to be constantly communicating with them just to make sure that things are right. So I'd rather just have the server return meaningful errors. I know that's a lot to ask, but like, just say, oh, this validation is incorrect, or, from the server side perspective. But I do agree, just validating like the simple things, I would be fine with that. I think trying to validate, like, I don't even know how you do that. Like every possible use case for a customer just seems crazy to me. So I would rather just like be like, okay, the YAML's good, and then if it's a Spinnaker issue, just have them run it. And then once they run into that issue, I mean, that's what you do with software today. When you run into an issue, especially like configuration issue, you go back and you fix it. I mean, if you think about it, right? Just last week, what Microsoft leaked 65,000 accounts due to a configuration issue, so it happens, it does, but that's typically how people solve it. They release a configuration, they just have more eyes on it, just make sure the configuration is good, and then they deploy, like you're not going to be able to save everyone with validation, and I think trying to go down that road is very difficult, and I think nearly impossible, to be honest.
Yeah, I definitely don't think we're going to validate for every customer use case. I think more from where I'm coming from, and maybe it helps to explain this a little bit more, is trying to get more folks into the community that are engaged in the project. If they're coming, like especially if they're going to spend the rest of the week at KubeCon and they're coming with more of a Kubernetes background, my assertion is that they're going to consider Spinnaker as more of an appliance. They're not going to consider it a platform. So when they go to an Argo, for example, and they do see those manifests and they do apply them very directly, it's very straightforward to go and look at the logs and say, hey, look, here's what's going on with my Argo instance. But we all know that's not the case with Spinnaker. There's 9 to 10 microservices that they're going to have to know somehow how to get into. And so that current gate at the client side is, I guess, a Band-Aid over the larger question of how we organize the project. And I don't necessarily want to solve that today. I think this is a shorter term solution while we figure out what we want to do at a larger project level and how we want to be more approachable to those people that are evaluating us in the context of these newer tools, right? And sure, like Argo is only Kubernetes, right? And it's only going to solve like a very narrow deployment pattern. But the more folks that we can get into the community, we can get, I guess, engaged and working on more ambitious projects than consolidating install methods.
Thanks very much, everyone, for the conversations. I'm going to ask a question from Ashley or a comment/question from Ashley on the SIG platform channel. So he's asking, hey, not everyone has Kubernetes clusters, which is where Halyard comes in handy. I get the pain point caused by Halyard, but perhaps we can do something similar to the operator by using Ansible playbooks. A fourth entrant to the
This seems uncontroversial. Like, yes, I feel like the conversation in this room is really exclusively about what to do for Kubernetes, and maybe I know it's not fair to say this out loud, but quote unquote nobody cares about the Debian package in this room at this moment, and so we're not talking about it. But for sure, let's make a maybe not very large Ansible playbook to install what could maybe be one Debian package, but is now 9 or 10 Debian packages. I think that conversation is going to end up spiraling into nowhere. Unless we're talking about a thing that's not really Spinnaker, like each of these pieces, you can argue about the borders of the pieces, but they really do have pretty different scale demands. And so like having 5 of this one and 3 of that one and 2 of that one really does make sense. And yes, when you're running one of everything, you could just have one, but again, the day 2 experience is not that. So anyway, back to you.
Right on. Sweet. Oh, we've got an online question as well. I'm going to give the mic over. Yeah.
This is from Shane Emery. I would like to know if the team has or will going to refactor the Cloud Driver service similar to something like Storm Driver or Go Cloud Driver.
That's a very good question. So that is a little bit, a little bit not quite in line with our current conversation in terms of the operator, but maybe it does relate. So for everyone who doesn't know, Home Depot produced a Go Cloud Driver. So it's Cloud Driver that handles Kubernetes accounts in particular. It is written in Go. So there are ways of managing and charting your accounts so that you can use both Go Cloud Driver and Cloud Driver separately and get the benefit from that. I think I haven't talked to Home Depot at all about this, right? But we could have a conversation. They are on the TOC, so we could have a conversation about adopting it into the community, so on and so forth. That's now another service that we have to manage, and it's written in a language that we don't necessarily have expertise in. So I think there's a lot of discussion that we should have if we want to go down that route. We came together as a TOC, not 100% all of us, but we did talk about wanting to improve the experience for new developers. So we want to reduce tech debt. This is around language consolidation. So we have Angular, React, 2 different frameworks in deck. We've got Kotlin, we've got Groovy, we've got Java. Do we want to add Go as well? And who's going to maintain it? So those are some questions I have in regards to that. I think it's still very early on. I haven't seen it run myself yet. But I think I would love to hear more, and I would also like to know if Home Depot is interested in contributing it in the first place. I do think that the operator would be able to help manage that potentially, but that's another question for another day.
Yeah, this topic probably is not in the platform, but to just add to the comments, Go Cloud Driver was originally done by Home Depot, but we at OpsMX, we did a lot of improvements on that. And so of course it's open source. One of the issues is it only is Kubernetes. It doesn't support AWS, GCP, Azure. And now that requires, again, one of the reasons that was done is it uses a lot fewer resources, and basically it doesn't do caching the same way that existing Cloud Driver does. But there are some limitations. We definitely need to talk about that. It is open source. We'll generate an RFC and see if it makes sense. The Storm Driver is the one that was created to support these kind of multiple instances. So you can have one instance running just AWS and one instance running just Kubernetes. It's like a proxy in front. That makes a lot of sense, particularly if we want to do sharding, reduce the resource consumption for individual Cloud Driver accounts. And we have documentation. We'll raise an RFC and see if the community prefers to go that way.
Can the user expand that question of like, what does he want to see specifically refactored?
Well, yeah. By the way, this is I would not use the word refactor to talk about this. This is like a gigantic rewrite and a massive conceptual shift.
So maybe so that we can focus on that conversation more, we can close the topic on install. There's been a lot of great feedback today. I appreciate everyone that's been sharing it. Maybe as a next step, instead of the RFC as it is today, we'll create a new RFC that captures the things that we care about as a community in terms of that install experience, so we agree on those first. And then the solution that follows matches those requirements, right? So that we're not saying, well, this is the best approach, or like automatically choosing one over the other. We're choosing the solution that matches that first. And I'm happy to help drive that. And I can post it when that happens in the SIG platform channel. Does that sound good? Okay, cool. So we can close that.
I don't have hands-on experience with this Go Cloud Driver either, but I did talk to James yesterday, and I don't know if, I guess I have no doubt that it's like faster and smaller, but I'm less sure whether it's faster and smaller enough to justify the sort of the difference. I'm not sure. Maybe you know, Gopi, if anybody's done an apples to apples comparison. Like, I'm not sure when the Go Cloud Driver was created whether the regular Java Cloud Driver had the ability to turn off caching for Kubernetes, and it does now. So like, you can flip a switch and not cache anything in Kubernetes. It's a config property. And for
We did have an apples comparison. It's a different caching mechanism. So if we turn off caching in today, the cloud driver, we won't get anything in the view, right? We can't see it. Right. But with the Go Cloud Driver, you do have the ability to see what's currently running in the target. So that feature you would have with the reduced resources. But there are definitely limitations if we can't replace it today. Right? The long way to go.
So did you do the apples to apples comparison?
Yes, we did.
What was the difference?
So if for about, say, 500 accounts, Cloud Driver accounts, the existing Cloud Driver, if it takes something like 12 GB RAM, Go Cloud Driver runs under 3 GB RAM. So something weird with that, the way Java is managing the cache there.
who's got another question? Is it Jennifer or Cameron? Are there any other questions? I guess I'll say, in the absence of all of this exciting discussion, there's some other much more boring stuff that's proceeding relatively behind the scenes, because it doesn't seem like that many people maybe care or want to help, which is okay. But there are like Spring Boot upgrades going on, and those Spring Boot upgrades facilitate Gradle upgrades, which facilitate Java upgrades, which might end up helping the apples to apples comparison. I don't want to wait for that to we should still talk about this Go Cloud Driver thing. And I don't know enough about Storm Driver. I know I saw some PRs go into Orca to make it so you can send Kubernetes requests to a different Cloud Driver URL than you can AWS requests and so on. I'm sure Storm Driver is sexier and fancier in ways that I don't understand. But it sounds like, I don't know, that the general notion of that mechanism, it seems like enough people think that's a good idea that it's happening one way or the other. And yeah, I guess we'll see where all this goes. I don't know exactly what the next step is for Go Cloud Driver, or who's gonna drive it forward and keep the conversations going. But I don't think I'm gonna have to worry about that. I think those conversations are gonna happen. Are there any other? I don't know how we're doing on time, but are there any other questions here? I feel like this is not a super busy day, so if we need to run over, it's fine. It's fine with me. But wonderful.
I guess from my perspective, me kind of trying to get into the world of the SIGs and where the landscape now. 3 years is a good long time. So where does the SIG start? So I see very clearly like the release. Where does it end in terms of responsibilities?
Totally, that's a really good question. Wow. Platform. I'm like speechless almost. I will say there's not too many SIGs that are very active right now. So we do want to consolidate the SIGs, and part of that might mean a bit more broad responsibilities or areas of coverage. The Platform SIG has traditionally been almost a catch-all. It was like, oh, build and release is really important. That needs to happen and be managed. And we built this plugin framework, and we're all kind of interested in those things. Like, let's just make it Platform SIG. And now we talk about a lot more there. So if you all ever come to the Platform SIGs, you'll find David and I there, and we're talking about all sorts of things. We touch on a lot of different things, and it would be nice to have a bit more focus and then be able to split out SIGs to handle build and release and test. SIGs to handle, I see a thumbs up over there, a SIG to handle the plugin framework improvements. SIG to handle these other things. But again, we need people to staff these and participate, and it does take work. But that's what we're here to help manage and bring people in to help with.
That we have now formally like established as like fully supports the platform, it's on cloud, docs.
Platform, yeah. So the SIGs that I at least intend to help promote and kind of revive the ones that I've kind of identified as high priority ones, and we have some agreement on the TOC as well, is the Platform SIG, the security SIG. It's a needed SIG. We need people on the security SIG. Jason has been doing a great job of running it by himself, but he's one guy, and that would be great. We need more leads on that. The cloud, we have an idea of having a cloud SIG. I do see that as having splitting into Kubernetes and then having another SIG for the other cloud providers. We used to have a policy where, and it still is the official policy, if you want a SIG or a cloud provider, you need to have a SIG associated with it and need to have it staffed. And that's just not the case right now. There's currently an AWS and a Kubernetes SIG, but there's no other cloud provider SIGs. There's a Google SIG too. Does it meet?
So I guess at the end of the day, maybe the better way is where can we go to see what SIGs are active?
So the governance, the governance repo, which we do need to update, and we have 2 other SIGs that we want to focus on too: contributor experience, and then the doc SIG. And we actually have our doc SIG lead right here, Tiffany, in the corner over here. So these are some things that we're going to want to update, and I mean. We do have a lot to update, and especially in that governance repo. And then we want to make some. We heard y'all yesterday, and we want to make a blog post. We want to share some sort of insight into what we've talked about as a TOC, and do that in a transparent way. Updating the governance repo and making it more clear which SIGs we do want to focus on. I think that's a topic of discussion today in the doc SIG. And
I don't know if this has gotten mentioned or gotten onto the list of greatest hits of possible SIGs, but one of the gaps that I see is in the UI, mostly because I'm not a JavaScript person and I'm not a React person and I'm not an Angular person, but people are trying to do work and get help, and there are very limited resources, at least that I know of, to make that happen. And even if there wasn't an actual UI SIG that met every couple weeks, if there was like a UI channel on Slack where people who knew about these things could hang out and people could ask questions, that would be very helpful. So if you are a JavaScript person or you have JavaScript friends, bring them on. We need them. And I guess I do feel like I want to mention this one other thing that we started to talk about last night, which ties into the notion of a separate build and release SIG, which is maybe also partly this conceptual difference between like a long-running SIG versus like a project-based SIG that gets spun up to accomplish a task and then goes away again, which is probably healthy for like we all know, if you don't exercise things, they don't end up working, but it will help us exercise the creation of SIGs and the destruction of SIGs and make sure the mechanics of all that work. In the general theme of like improving quality and reducing barriers to entry and reducing friction in all of our lives, there was an RFC about this, I don't know, some time ago, and it faded. But we have what I'll call an existence proof of it being a good idea, which is the mono repo idea. Right now there are, I don't know, like 10 repos: Cloud Driver, Deck, Echo, Fiat, Front 50, Igor, Gate, Roscoe, Orca, Kayenta, Keel, Quark, and on and on and on, depending how far you go, Halyard. And the fine people at Apple have made their lives easier by putting them all in one Git repo, which for the record means like no more version bumping and no more like weird versions of Cloud Driver versus weird versions of Echo versus weird versions of Orca versus the actual version of Spinnaker that we know about. And it also means like finding out when you broke something when you break it, so then you fix it instead of not finding out when you break something. And I think Joe has even signed up to like help make that happen in the upstream universe. And it's sort of not fair to talk about it without, Joe should be the one talking about it. And anyway, but it's also this, we have a bunch of people here. And so I wanted to get the idea out in the world so that it's not as big of a shock and surprise if it does happen, and open the floor for comments, or maybe give the mic to Joe. And I don't know, just thought I'd say something about it, and we'll see what happens.
Sure. Just as a little bit of background, we have an internal fork of the project that we need to keep continually updated with open source, and across the 9, 10-ish repos, whatever it is, it's a huge chore. So the approach we ended up taking was combining all of them into a single repo made of Git subtrees, and we just merge with subtree strategies, and that's it's very sane. We build everything composite, similar to what I was talking about in the demo yesterday with plugins. Same idea. Gradle composite just builds everything at the same time. We have a Gradle build cache, which speeds up repeated builds dramatically. I would say a Gradle build cache is almost a requirement to operate in this way, because, for example, if there's a cork change, you would necessarily have to run tests for every other service that depends on cork, and there's a little bit of dependency graphing there that's implemented in the Gradle tooling. That's not automatic. That's by hand. It's like, hey, if we see a change to this folder, run tests for XYZ cloud driver. If you run everything that depends on cork, same for Fiat. There's a change to Fiat. We run builds for everything that depends on Fiat, and the whole graph is implemented in that way. It's not a very complicated procedure, but it's just a little bit of hand tuning that's part of that process. But in the end, our release process is zero work. It's just there's a button that builds everything and ships containers and ships jars and rewrites them according to what we need to do. And it's been an incredibly smooth experience. Once the transition is also pretty straightforward, because how we did the transition was we just kept continually integrating into the new thing, and then had that start producing artifacts, and then just eventually stopped using the old things, and then just reintegrated instead of from like what we were working on internally to new thing we're working on internally. It just goes straight from the outside world straight into the internal repository. So eventually we just stopped working on the old individual repository forks, because they'd all just been, you can just write a thing that runs periodically and just slurps up all the changes and merges them in. So, which is essentially what happened. So it's an approach I'd recommend. I think we could definitely revive the RFC, add some clarity and context and we can add some of our experience as well as to illuminate all of that, and we'll, see where that goes. And other people may, I see there's some excitement about it over there, so that's good. After I'll be honest, after the original, I read the original proposal, and I was like, oh yeah, very nice. But then it was, there were objections and it didn't get implemented, but we ended up doing it ourselves, and it's been a huge improvement. So, and like I said, with Gradle build caching, very important.
Just to expand on the cache a little bit, because I don't know if everyone's familiar with the Gradle build cache, but you could actually have a remote cache. So originally, when we did the mono repo, it made our builds, especially if we made a cork change, it would be over an hour just to do all the CI/CD jobs. But once we added the remote cache, it took 15, 20 minutes. It was a huge improvement. So and all you need to do, it's just a Docker image. So it's, just pull that Docker image, you deploy it, and it's that easy. So yeah, I just wanted to give you some clarity there.
I'm super excited for this. It will also dramatically simplify the release process. It will now be two commands, git tag and git push, which is fantastic. I think there were some concerns the first time about like how big a machine you would need to be able to work on Spinnaker, and part of, at least maybe this is like a sort of tangential goal, but I think one of the consequences of this is that I think it would lower the barrier to entry for people if it then sort of simultaneously raises it, because we all have to have super dope computers to be able to build it. That would be a bit of a drag, although I mostly think it would be worth it. So I think we'll have to see, but I don't know, like the sort of the minimum system requirements to be able to develop on Spinnaker, they're already pretty brutal because CloudDriver is massive. And I think from what I heard, there's maybe a little bit of an IntelliJ magic to make it so you don't need to have like a 800 gigabyte machine on your desk. So I guess that's a little bit TBD, but I'm hopeful. Signs are good.
Yeah. One thing that we've done internally at Armory, and it's I could see these things kind of going together a bit, is we tag all of our images with the same version. So there's no need for a BOM. You can just download all the images of that same tag. So it does simplify that process a little bit as well. Unfortunately, with the Spinnaker project, the service versions are all over the place. I wouldn't personally be opposed to changing the version scheme, but that's a conversation for another time. How are we doing on time, by the way?
We're over by a couple minutes.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. We will hopefully see y'all next Thursday at the Platform SIG. The governance repo, there's a SIG index page, and you can check out the meeting calendar, and it adjusts for your time zone.
For the record, the weekly Spinnaker office hours is supposed to start 3 minutes ago, but I'm unilaterally canceling it.